The Jets have already begun making moves in the secondary, but is a big splash to come in free agency or the draft? We're talking corners and safeties on today's episode of the Locked On Jets podcast.
You are Locked On Jets, your daily New York Jets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome. This is the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. It's Friday, March 11th, 2022, and I'm your host, John B. from GangGreenNation.com. Thank you so much for making the show your first listen or your first watch every day, as we're free and available on all platforms, including YouTube. If you like what you see or hear, hit the subscribe button. You'll get notifications as new episodes are posted. And if you're watching on YouTube, I ask this every day, please give this episode a thumbs up. It helps the channel. It helps other Jets fans find Locked On Jets. The last few weeks, I've done a Prospect Friday show, where on Fridays, I've given you my thoughts on an NFL draft prospect. We will continue that in the future, but today, I'm focused on the secondary because free agency is almost upon us. Next week, players will begin negotiating contracts with new teams. They'll agree to terms. They'll sign new deals. You'll see a lot of player movement. And two areas where you could see the Jets active are corner and safety. And this will conclude our positional review series that we've been doing over the last few weeks, where I've been going position by position through the Jets. We're closing it out today by talking about the secondary. And this is an interesting spot for the Jets because I think there's a question, how much are they going to emphasize it this offseason? If you've been following Robert Saleh during his brief Jets career, it's clear the focus has been up front. It's been on building the defensive line. And that's a sign, first of all, that that's where the Jets feel the value is in their defense. They want to build it around the defensive line. They think a good defensive line can compensate for issues in other areas. But it also might be a sign that the coaching staff is confident they can develop players in the back end of the defense easier than the front end. I almost view the way the Jets approached last offseason as a sign that they view defensive linemen as very difficult to find, very difficult to develop. And that's the reason you pay for it. You pay a premium for things that are difficult to find. Whereas they have confidence in their ability to coach guys up in the secondary. And if you look at Robert Saleh's career, he spent the early part of his NFL coaching career with the Seattle Seahawks at a time where they built one of the great secondaries in NFL history through a bunch of late-round picks. I mean, Earl Thomas was the only first-round pick in the Legion of Boom. You had Cam Chancellor, who was kind of a mid-round pick, playing strong safety for them. At corner, you had Richard Sherman, who was become a Hall of Fame player, a fifth-round pick. Jeremy Lane out of the slot, who was not an early pick. Byron Maxwell, a late-round pick. Brandon Browner signed out of the CFL. So they've pretty much figured out ways to develop guys with long arms who had the skill sets they were looking for. And then in San Francisco, when Saleh was the defensive coordinator there, they did not invest heavily. They got some veteran reclamation projects. They got Richard Sherman relatively cheap off an injury. They were able to kind of turn things around without investing heavily in the defensive backfield there, and turned into a pretty good secondary. So, you can't question the results. I do question whether the Jets may try and make a big move to upgrade their secondary this offseason, though. Last year, they went about it, and they brought in a bunch of guys who, unheralded, not big draft pedigrees, and they kind of just said, we're going to go with these young guys and hope that they get experience, and we'll live with the mistakes. Heading into last year, I figured the Jets would probably bring in a couple of veterans. They bring in somebody who would be a starter on one side. Then on the other side, they bring in maybe a stopgap veteran and have them compete with Bryce Hall, because Bryce Hall was a guy who had potential, but you weren't sure whether he was a starter material for the Jets. Instead, they just went completely young. Bryce Hall was pretty much inserted into the number one corner role, even though you had no idea whether he could actually play. And then on the other side, they used a late-round pick, Brandon Echols, after cutting Bless Austin. You have to remember, they cut Bless Austin near the end of training camp. It seemed like Bless Austin was going to be a starter for this team, and then he was cut. And Brandon Echols stepped into the starting lineup for the team. And in the slot, you had Michael Carter II. I think the Jets were looking for leadership from their veteran safety duo, Marcus Maye and Lamarcus Joyner, and we'll talk about them a little bit later. But we're going to begin talking about the corners. And I think you have to begin with Bryce Hall, who showed, even though he was a huge question mark entering the season and thrust into the number one corner role, he showed that even if he's not a legitimate number one corner in this league, he's a player. He's the kind of guy the Jets can go forward with. He's a starter for this team going forward. And what's interesting about Bryce Hall, if you followed the Jets defense last year, I think what you found is, at least as far as I could tell, they play a lot of zone on the early downs, but on third down, they get more aggressive. The defense kind of changes between first and second down and third down. In the early downs, they like to play lots of zone. I'm not sure they like to blitz as much, whereas they became a very aggressive defense on third down. Now, whether that changes once Carl Lawson returns to the lineup, I'm not sure. Did they feel like they had to manufacture a pass rush on passing downs because Lawson was out? And which, if you're going to blitz, typically you're going to play man coverage behind that. And you're blitzing more because your number one pass rusher's out. I mean, I don't know. But what's interesting is Hall kind of has a reputation of being a zone corner. And I think his skill set's more suited to zone, but he actually held up okay in man coverage last year. Now, there were some games where he wasn't great. I mean, I think about that Tampa Bay game late season where he had a lot of trouble with guys like Mike Evans. This is the type of stuff that makes me question whether, he's the kind of guy you build around as a number one corner. But as a number two corner, I think he certainly fits. Now, across from him, he had Brandon Echols this season, and I think Brandon Echols is the type of guy where the perception of him is better than the reality. I've compared him to Bless Austin recently. They're not really the same type of corner. They're not really the same type of body type, but I compare him to Bless Austin from the standpoint that I think early in Bless Austin's career, the perception of him was better than the reality, and that's because Bless Austin got a lot of playing time as a very young player. I think that there's always the idea that, if you play when you're a young player, the experience is going to help you develop into a good player. I'm not sure that's there out of Brandon Echols. Everybody remembers that pick six out against Miami. Didn't show a lot of great ball skills. I think he was an issue in run support. In this defense, I think your corners have to be able to tackle, and Brandon Echols had some issues with tackling. Maybe he's a little small, but it just wasn't great. And I look at this guy, I mean, I don't see overwhelming tools. I think he could be a backup. I mean, I don't know that he's a starter for this team going forward. I think he could be a backup, and I think sometimes I'm too dismissive. I think sometimes too many people are dismissive of the value a good backup brings, and I think Brandon Echols could be that. I don't know that Brandon Echols is like the kind of guy you want as a starter, though, for the Jets going forward. Now, in the slot, you have Michael Carter II. I tried to give him the nickname, the sequel, because the Jets drafted Michael Carter, the original, the running back, in the 4th round, and they drafted Michael Carter II in the 5th round. And if you actually look through news articles, you can find that there was a very funny moment in the 4th round because the Jets were interested in both Michael Carter and Michael Carter II in their war room, where apparently there was a point where somebody said, "Wait, we picked the right Michael Carter, didn't we?" Well, as it turned out, it didn't really matter because they got both of them. I like Michael Carter II, and there were some bad moments for him late in the season. I think he was one of those guys who began the season playing pretty well and then did not really sustain his level of play late in the season. I think that there were some issues, especially tackling, which if you play the slot, you got to be able to tackle well because you don't have the sideline there to help you out. When you play on the outside, you can kind of steer a guy to the sideline and limit the amount of space a receiver has, whereas when you play in the slot, you kind of have to cover the whole field, which means you're going to give up receptions. And many times success is about just tackling the guy after he makes the reception because there's just too much ground to cover to prevent a lot of catches from being gained against you. So you have to be able to make tackles. He was doing well early in the season. I think later in the season there were a few issues. I still like him going forward, though. I think he's part of the solution going forward. And really, I think if you're the Jets, as much as anything, you need another outside corner to go across from Hall, maybe like a number one type corner, and then Echols slides into a backup role. And then beyond them, I mean, you have Isaiah Dunn, who the Jets gave a record contract to last year for undrafted free agents, which not a lot of money, but Jets gave him a ton of bonus money last year, and I still can't figure it out. He was very bad in preseason, got some action after some injuries happened during the season. He was a big culprit in a game against Miami at the Meadowlands in November, where the Jets had a lot of breakdowns in their secondary. He wasn't great. You have Javelin Guidry, another guy who I think is a backup. I think Javelin Guidry is a backup level player because there were some good games. And he actually showed more versatility than I thought. For a small guy, he wasn't great on the outside. Listen, he's better on the inside. He's better as a slot corner. He's better playing closer to where the action is on the inside. But did hold up for a couple games on the outside, and then had some horrible games like when the Jets kept putting him against Stephon Diggs. Again, I think the value of a backup can be underrated because there were a couple games where Javelin Guidry played decently. Not the kind of guy you want to count on over the long haul, but a guy who did give the Jets some decent snaps at various points during the season. So that's the corner situation for the Jets. There's young guys there. There's actually a decent amount of young talent. I don't know that there's like the number one type of guy. I'm not sure there's the type of guy you build your scheme around. There are guys who can play to varying levels, probably more backups than starters, not a lot of impact talent, a good corner in Bryce Hall, a guy with promise out of the slot in Michael Carter II, some guys who actually could be decent depth guys. There still needs some work. There's still some work to be done, though. Now, heading into last season, I'm sure the Jets thought safety was much stronger than corner. They had a pair of veteran guys they had confidence in. They thought they were going to get steady play. However, injuries and ineffective play made it kind of a weakness for the Jets last season. Ahead here on the Locked On Jets podcast, we'll review what happened at the safety position, and we'll talk about what the Jets might do going forward and what they've already done because a move has been made at the safety position this week. That's ahead here on this Friday episode of Locked On Jets. Of course, NFL free agency begins next week, but so does the NCAA tournament. It's finally upon us, and from all the latest odds, contests, and player props, BetOnline.net is the number one source for all your sports betting needs and info. BetOnline remains the best spot for all your sports scores, podcasts, and news this season. And it's not just basketball. BetOnline is your continued source for all your sports wagering information needs, including live betting and your favorite Vegas casino games. Head to the website today or use your mobile device to learn more about the trends and action. BetOnline, where the game starts. Thank you again for making Locked On Jets your first listen or your first watch every day. We are free and available on all platforms, including YouTube. If you like this episode, please give it a thumbs up. It helps the channel out, and it helps other Jets fans find Locked On Jets. Today we're talking about the Jets secondary. Heading into the 2021 season, I think there was a lot of confidence in the safety position. You had Maye returning after a career year where he won the team MVP award. You had Lamarcus Joyner, who the Jets imported from the Raiders, who seemed like a solid veteran addition, a guy who had kind of struggled playing the slot, but the Jets were moving him back to safety, a position where he had more success through his career. And it did not work out, and part of the reason it did not work out was injuries. Lamarcus Joyner played a handful of snaps in the opener against Carolina before suffering a season-ending injury. And kind of surprisingly, yesterday, news broke that the Jets are re-signing him on a one-year deal. And honestly, I don't hate the move. I thought he was a guy the Jets would move on from. I don't hate the idea that he's back, though, because I feel like he gives you a certain floor at the safety position. I can't imagine he's going to be very expensive. Last year he signed like kind of a one-year, what you call a prove-it deal worth $3 million, and he was injured. So you would imagine the price would probably go down. So the price certainly did not go up. I mean, listen, if Joe Douglas is paying Lamarcus Joyner more this year than last year, then Joe Douglas made a horrible deal, and Joe Douglas should be criticized. I think we can assume he's probably making less. Maybe he's making about the same. I mean, it was not an expensive contract. I don't hate the move. As long as like they're not counting on him, like if this is like a depth move, even if it's like we're going to draft somebody or we're going to bring in a young player and he's going to compete with Lamarcus Joyner, that's the type of move that makes sense to me. I don't love the idea of like we're counting on a guy who barely played last year because he was injured, who's in his 30s. I don't love the move if like if he's like locked in as a starter, but I don't hate the move if it's kind of like just bringing him in, make sure you have depth, make sure you have a certain floor. Because the Jets don't really have a lot at the safety position under contract at the moment. Of course, there's Marcus Maye, and his situation was famously pretty ugly with the Jets this past season. He was brought back on the franchise tag, which every player hates. No player wants to be on the franchise tag. They want the long-term deal. They want the money. And Maye's a good example of why, because if Maye had hit free agency last year, he would have been looking at a big money deal. Now he's coming off a year where, he's coming off a serious injury where he didn't play that well. Probably looking at a few $1 million. He's probably looking at a one-year deal to try and rebuild his value. That's the reason players hate the franchise tag. Now, Maye did make a lot of money this year. Don't get me wrong, but he would have made a lot more money if he had been able to hit the open market last season. In all honesty, even before he got hurt, he wasn't playing that well. I mean, we talk about how many big plays the Jets allowed, That did not begin when Marcus Maye left the lineup. In fact, I know this because I was actually researching an article late in the season. I was going to write an article about how Marcus Maye leaving the lineup had a huge impact on the Jets, how they were giving up so many more big plays as a result of him leaving the lineup. And then I actually did the research. And this is what happens sometimes is you have a theory and you do the research, and it turns out the theory was not true. The Jets were giving up big plays at a very high rate before Maye left the lineup. And, thinking back to it and rewatching some of the film, you realize Marcus Maye really wasn't that good last year. Marcus Maye has been a very good player for the Jets. Last year was kind of a down year. His second year in the league in 2018, he was injured a lot. He suffered a lot of injuries, kind of a lost season. But it feels like this is kind of heading for a departure. It kind of feels like the ship has sailed on Marcus Maye staying a member of the New York Jets. It's kind of unfortunate because the guy's been very solid during his time here. If it was based on performance, he should get a big money deal. But just going forward, he's approaching 30. He's coming off a serious injury. He's coming off kind of a down year. I just don't see it happening. And beyond that, if you're Marcus Maye and you've played for 5 years on the Jets and you've never had a winning season, you never come close to having a winning season, aren't you going to look to go to a winning team? That's what I would do. And there's going to be some team out there with a needed safety who's going to give him a kind of a prove it deal, and he'll have an opportunity to go play with them and hopefully play effectively and hopefully rebuild some of his value. Marcus Maye has been a great member of the Jets. Unfortunate, it seems like things are kind of moving in another direction. Beyond that, you have Ashton Davis, and listen, in all honesty, I did not love it when the Jets drafted Ashton Davis in the third round in 2020. I was willing to give him a shot. We're 2 years in, and he doesn't look like a player. He looks like, at best, maybe the kind of guy who can be a depth player who helps you out on special teams, maybe. He just doesn't have the instincts. How many times... Listen, he's got the physical tools. He's fast. He's got that track background. He's not instinctive. He takes so many bad angles. And the thing is, at the safety position, you don't want to notice... There are some guys you don't want to notice. And Ashton Davis is one of those guys. When the Jets had Jamal Adams and Marcus Maye, you noticed Jamal Adams because he played close to the line. He was kind of a destructive player near the line. He was making plays. Marcus Maye was good because you didn't notice him because he was playing in the back of the defense. And there are certain players, I talked about this earlier in the week, there are certain players that when they're doing well, you don't notice them. You only notice them when they're playing poorly. And for a guy who's playing in the back of the defense, you don't want to notice them because if they're doing their job, they're essentially taking away the deep part of the field. And nobody's going to test them. Whereas Ashton Davis just stands out. His issues were, I think, more in the run game than in coverage, but there were still some coverage plays where he was totally out of position on long plays that went against the Jets. How many long... I know it did not begin when Marcus Maye went out of the lineup, but it also did not end when Marcus Maye went out of the lineup. Ashton Davis was responsible for so many big plays. Look, he's 2 years in. I just don't have I see people have hopes that he can develop. I would be happy if he could develop. I don't see it at all in him. And maybe, listen, nobody would be happier a year from now if I'm doing this positional review and I'm saying, man, I did not see Ashton Davis developing. He proved me wrong. I hope he does, but I just don't see it out of him. Beyond that, you have Elijah Riley, great story, guy who was a Jets fan as a kid, practice squatter, has worked his way up to the lineup after the Jets suffered some injuries. Made a few plays. He can deliver a big hit, but really a guy's a practice squad level player. If Elijah Riley's seeing big snaps for your team, I think you've got problems. And then there are a few other guys who saw various degrees of playing time this past season. One of them, Will Parks, the Jets re-signed yesterday. They got him off waivers from Miami late in the season. And you could be forgiven if you saw that Will Parks re-signed yesterday with the Jets and said, who was Will Parks? Because I got to be honest with you, I had to look up Will Parks. I did not remember him. He played a couple games late in the season for the Jets, claimed off waivers for it wasn't that great, to be honest with you, but, and I don't know how much upside's there, but he'll be back in camp for depth. And you also have Jason Pinnock, who kind of began the season as a corner late in the year because of the injuries, got some opportunities at safety, and in brief action actually played pretty well at safety, so maybe a bit of a wild card at the safety position. The guy the Jets drafted late rounds last year out of Pittsburgh. Again, not a guy you want to count on. I don't know that you want to go into the season saying Jason Pinnock is penciled into the starting lineup, but maybe a wild card guy with put some good film out there late last season at the safety position. So, who knows? Maybe there's a success story waiting to happen there. So that's what the Jets have at corner and safety, but there are going to be some opportunities should the Jets choose to prioritize the secondary to really upgrade. There are some potential splash moves in free agency. There are some potential early round prospects who could interest the Jets, and we'll talk about them ahead on this Friday episode of the Locked On Jets podcast. Hopefully, the Jets make their secondary next year as good as Built Bar, because Built Bar is the best tasting protein bar on the market. I got to tell you, these may be protein bars, but they do not taste like protein bars. They're covered in 100% real chocolate. Not only that, they're pretty healthy for you. Most bars contain 130 calories, 4 grams of sugar, 4 net carbs, and 17 grams of protein. And there are so many delicious flavors. You got mint brownie, you got coconut almond. How about puffs? Puffs are the first ever protein-infused marshmallow. They're puffy, they're marshmallowy, they're not just a protein bar, they're a treat. And they're covered in 100% real chocolate. Puffs are a fan favorite with some incredible flavors. You got yummy cinnamony, you've got coconut marshmallow, banana cream pie. They're so good, and all of these could be your new favorite. So check out all the options at Built.com. Again, that's Built.com, Built.com. See which delicious Built bar is for you. This is the Locked On Jets podcast on this Friday. We're talking about the secondary for the Jets today. We've talked about the performance of the corners and the safeties in 2021. Now let's talk about what the Jets are going to do in 2022. And part of this will come down to the philosophy Robert Saleh and Joe Douglas have. They could just continue with what they're doing. They could continue to believe in their ability to coach guys up. They could go young and cheap in the secondary. But there are also going to be some opportunities for this team to make a big splash. You look at the corner position. The big name out there is J.C. Jackson. Lots of buzz among Jets fans for J.C. Jackson. I've said this before, I'll say it again. I don't love him as a scheme fit. I think, as I talked about earlier, in this scheme, you want to have guys who are both comfortable playing zone on early downs and man on late downs. To me, J.C. Jackson's a guy who, through most of his career, has been much stronger in man. Although, I will say this. Somebody who can cover one-on-one is a great commodity to have in the NFL these days because there just aren't many good man corners, and the Jets do man up on a lot of the key downs, so I can see the fit from that perspective. But the other thing that bugs me about J.C. Jackson, how many times have you seen a guy leave New England, get a big money deal, and then fail on his new team? It seems like Belichick really knows when to let a guy go. So this is pure speculation, but I'm a little worried about signing somebody that Belichick has decided it's okay to let him hit the market, because there aren't a lot of guys who leave New England and get better. And there are lots of guys who leave New England and suddenly lose their ability to play well. So I'm a little worried about J.C. Jackson. I think Carlton Davis is a better fit. I think he's a great, I think his skills fit with the type of zones the Jets run. And I think he also has the tools to play man-to-man. So if the Jets are going to make a big splash at the corner position, that's a guy that makes sense to me. If you're looking for more of a veteran guy, and I don't love the idea of the Jets signing guys in their 30s, but Casey Hayward seems like the type of guy who would fit what the Jets want to do on defense if they wanted to go less expensive, more veteran route at the corner position. And in the draft, there are a couple guys who could be intriguing early. Sauce Gardner out of Cincinnati, a big-time winner at the Combine, lots of length, the type of physical tools the Jets look for in a corner if they really want to push this secondary to the next level. And then you also have Daryl Stingley out of LSU, a more controversial prospect because a lot of the reason he's viewed as a top pick happened his freshman year 2 years ago, and there hasn't been as much great stuff the last couple of years. It's more of a projection pick, but a guy who could be available early at the corner position. Then you look at safety. I mean, there are some options in free agency at the top of the markets. Marcus Williams, a guy who I think would fit I think it would fit pretty much anybody really well. And given the way the Jets have had issues giving up big plays, I think sticking Marcus Williams in the back of this defense would fix a lot. The question is, how high is the price going to get? Because this year's, there are going to be a lot of teams with cap space, and there aren't a lot of premium free agents. So you may get to a point where Marcus Williams just becomes too expensive. So we'll see what happens there. I mean, there are some other second-tier options. I mean, I think the ship has kind of sailed on a Maye return. I wouldn't hate it, though, if the Jets decided to bring him back for cheap. Beyond that, in the draft, there are a couple of intriguing options early. There's obviously Kyle Hamilton out of Notre Dame, which brings the whole question of, do you take a safety in the top 10 into play? If you don't want to do that, Lewis Seen out of Georgia looks like a really solid prospect. He might be there at one of the Jets' 2 second-round picks, so they want to address safety, and they don't want to invest a top 10 pick in at the position. Maybe you go with Seen and hope he's available there at one of your 2 second-round slots. And there are options out there, though, for the Jets. The question is, how much do they want to prioritize that? And to be honest with you, I'm not sure. I guess we'll find out heading into next week. But that's all for our show, and that's all for Locked On Jets for this week. This has been the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. As always, if you enjoy the show, subscribe to it. You'll never miss an episode if you do. If you're watching on YouTube, please give this episode a thumbs up. It helps the channel out, and it helps other Jets fans find this podcast. Have a great weekend. Next week, we'll be adding new members of the Jets as free agency will begin in the NFL, and we'll be here to talk about it.